Characterization in Chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby is revealed through Nick. He develops throughout the book by the way he talks about people. In the beginning, he is a non-judgmental person, and towards the end, he speaks differently about the people. In his writing on his characters around Jordan, the details are not as clear as when his character is not around Jordan. She sort of clouds his mind because he likes her. Nick is so involved in their lives, and he realizes it's that because no one else cared. No one else even cared enough to show up to Gatsby's funeral. A quote from the book is, "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and not let other people clean up the mess that they had made." Nick did not like the way that they reacted to the murder of Myrtle. They went on without consequences and careless about their actions and acted like it never even happened. Another character that is introduced in Chapter 9 is Henry C. Gatz, also known as Mr. Gatz. He's Gatsby's father. He heard about the news of his son's death in the Chicago newspaper. Mr. Gatz doesn't know much about how his son earned his money. Mr. Gatz is extremely proud of his son. He believed that his son was a well-educated, brilliant man that lots of people loved, and couldn't believe that a madman could have done such a thing. A quote from the book is, "After changing my clothes, I went next door and found Mr. Gatz walking up and down excitedly in the hall. His pride in his son and in his son's possessions was continuously increasing." It's important because it shows, again, the pride that he had. The list that Mr. Gatz finds in Gatsby's old book shows how he tried to achieve his dreams through education and hard work and practice and saving money, and it shows that it could be attained if he would have stuck to it.
In Chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby, the main theme was that money can make people fall in love with us. Throughout the book, Jay Gatsby had parties every single weekend. Hundreds of people came from East Egg and West Egg to come to his parties. He lived in a castle also known as his house, because he had so much money. So when people came to his parties, everyone knew of Gatsby, but no one really knew of like who he was. People fell in love with Mr. Gatsby because of his money and his parties. But when Gatsby died, nobody came to his funeral. Only one person that went to his parties came to his funeral, and that was Nick. A quote from the book that shows that no one came to his funeral is this: "The minister glanced at his watch several times, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for half an hour. But it wasn't any use. Nobody came." Gatsby also had a thing with Daisy, as we all know. Daisy was falling in love with Mr. Gatsby because of his money. Everyone that came over to it, or when she came over to his house, she fell in love with Mr. Gatsby because of all of his money and what his house was and everything that he had. But when Tom found out about Mr. Gatsby and Daisy, Daisy had to choose between Tom or Gatsby. From then on, she kind of disappears from the book. She wasn't even at Gatsby's funeral. A quote that shows this is, I could only remember without resent that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. This shows that money does make people fall in love with us."
Point of view and figure of language are a key aspect in Chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald uses these to show how money can buy love. A symbol in The Great Gatsby in Chapter 9 is no one showing up to Gatsby's funeral. Nick receives a phone call from someone in Chicago, presuming they are talking to Gatsby. The person on the other end of the phone talks about how someone got caught buying bonds over the counter. Fitzgerald doesn't say it here, but we assume this is how Gatsby makes his money. Fitzgerald does this to provide an aha moment for the reader, thinking they achieved something. Mr. Gatz, Gatsby's father, shows up for Gatsby's funeral. Filled with pride, he believes that Gatsby is basically a god. He talks about how Gatsby would have been a great man. Nick knows this isn't true, but out of respect doesn't tell Gatsby's father how his son became wealthy. Nick says, "That's true," I said, uncomfortably. He knows it would have helped the situation. Later in the chapter, Kip Springer, a man that lived in Gatsby's house and lived off his wealth, completely ignored Gatsby's funeral. He called Nick not about the funeral or about Gatsby's death, but about a pair of shoes he left there. After that, Gatsby returns and talks to Gatsby's dad, Mr. Gatz. Mr. Gatz says Gatsby was a different man when it came to his father. He wasn't Jay Gatz. He wasn't Jay Gatsby. He was Jay Gatz, retaining his old life and old morals. Mr. Gatz says, and ever since he made a success, he was very generous with me. This helps Nick see Gatsby wasn't the man he portrayed. The funeral comes and no one shows up, and even Mr. Gatz becomes aware and nervous that no one is going to show up. At the funeral, only servants, along with Nick, Mr. Gatz, show up. Servants were the only people to show up, and it's only because they were still getting paid. Without the money, who knows if they would even be there? Relates back to the theme that money can buy love. At Gatsby's funeral, Owl Eyes is blown away by how nobody shows up, saying, "Why, my God, they used to come by the hundreds." He then takes off his glasses in sorrow and says, "The poor sons of bitches." And the last of the chapter, Nick is getting ready to leave, and he sees a green light, and Gatsby wishing he could get to the green light along with Daisy. Nick says he, Gatsby, did not know that it was already behind him. He then realizes that the green light, along with Daisy, were in Gatsby's past. And since he can't go back in time, he can never obtain Daisy and that one green light.